Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Philippa Hart from Hart Training and Recruitment, and welcome to our Menopause in the Workplace session. I'd like to introduce my associates, Ruth Forster and Charlotte Sykes. As many of you know, we work together as part of our Recruitment People Strategy Programme, where we're supporting our clients with their people and talent for the future. And I'm delighted that we have our special guest, Jo Jinks from Synergize HR. Jo and I have known each other a long time, and we've been chatting in the background about this topic and well-being, and she is the perfect person to talk to us about it today. So, Jo, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Philippa. And yes, we don't look old enough to have known each other for a long time, but we have. I'm really delighted to be here today. Menopause is an interesting subject, and as we know, over the last few months, probably 12 months at least, the profile of menopause has grown exponentially. But I think there's still some myths out there. And definitely from an employment perspective, I think that the link between menopause and the workplace is still not well addressed really in the business. By now, I think everybody knows that menopause is quite a natural process, and it does impact women in different ways. So some women will suffer with lots of symptoms, some women will suffer with no symptoms at all. But even so, there's still a responsibility for the business and the individual to be able to manage that in the workplace, because ultimately what we want is an engaged workforce, don't we? We want to have open communication, and what we don't want is we don't want to create an environment of fear. We don't want managers to fear having a conversation, and we don't want women and anyone else who's going through menopausal symptoms to have fear of not being able to raise their concerns or even be really open and honest about their symptoms and take the accountability for that. Obviously, there's a legal side, as you know, with most HR things, there's a legal side that we have to consider. So menopause in itself is not characterised as a protective characteristic from an equality perspective. But as with most medical conditions, it's how that manifests itself. So there are hundreds probably of symptoms of menopause that could be classed as a disability. And I guess that's where I would start from a legal perspective. If menopause symptoms have a long-term and substantial impact on a woman's ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activity, then these could be considered a disability. If they come and go, they may not be classed as a disability. And then once they are classed as a disability, then the individual that's suffering with those symptoms, and I don't know about you, but I hate using the word suffering with those symptoms. But if they're suffering with those symptoms for that sustained period, then they would have a disability and therefore would have protection from an equality perspective under the Equal Act. And they would be able to claim against a business that didn't make reasonable adjustments or didn't make any adjustments or have any conversations with them to help them go about their day-to-day work in a positive way and make reasonable adjustments, which is one of the biggest parts of dealing with anybody who has got any kind of medical condition. We know also now that the new government are going to bring in a requirement for businesses to who have at least 250 employees, I should say, to have an annual menopause action plan. And that's announced as part of the Make Work Pay plan. But also it will be part of the Employment Rights Bill, which has had its first reading in Parliament today. So it'd be really interesting to see what the requirements of that are. However, it probably will upset quite a few of my HR clients, my HR colleagues at this point, when I say to you that menopause is one medical condition in the workplace. And for me, menopause has to be viewed in a bigger picture. It has to be viewed as part of a well-being process, because there are lots of conditions that people suffer with in their day-to-day life and in the workplace. And we know that mental health is an ongoing concern for businesses and for individuals. So I'm not particularly a fan of having a separate menopause policy. What I'm a fan of is having a well-being policy that raises the awareness of menopause as it would with any other medical condition. And I really encourage my clients to think about it in the broader perspective. I'm a menopausal woman myself. and I would know from my perspective what reasonable adjustments I would like my employer to make. And they could be very simple things. But we have an assumption as an individual and as an employee that our manager will know exactly what they need to do. And we have an assumption that our manager will know what reasonable adjustments I need. But how many times do we know managers are put into positions and not provided the training and education that they need to be able to have these conversations? So if the manager's not got the education and the knowledge and the individual thinks they have, there's always going to be a disconnect between the two. So I'm very much encouraging employees to have some accountability. So tell me what would be reasonable for you. So for me, I tend to recommend that businesses use a reasonable adjustment plan, which is something that I developed with an organisation last year, which was very beneficial for them. And it basically allows an individual to say, these are my symptoms. This is how it impacts me on a day-to-day basis. And I think this is what could be reasonable from your perspective as a business and a manager to help me so that I can come to work every day, continue to function as best as I can, but know that I've got your support to be able to function. And actually that reasonable adjustment plan can be used for all kinds of medical conditions, not just menopause. The business can then take that away and the manager can take that away and go, okay, that is reasonable. And I know if I can provide this woman with a fan, or I can sit her by the window, or I can provide loose clothing for them to work, actually that's going to help them. And it forms part of a conversation then. It's something that the manager can revisit all the time without feeling awkward because the person's already shared that information with them, and the employee can also speak to the manager about because they've also shared that information. So it creates that open culture that we should provide in a workplace anyway. Obviously, a lot of menopause symptoms aren't very visible. Unless you see, like I do, like sweat sometimes because I'm too hot in the coldest of environments. So we can't, as I said, assume that managers will know that someone's going through the menopause. And also, I would not encourage managers to say to a woman, "Are you menopausal?" Because that's not the best way to create that conversation. Education is absolutely.
Can I just say that it's very interesting how, I know I'm generalising now, but as another woman may think it's acceptable to say that to somebody, but it isn't. But it is a challenge when, if you see a colleague that you know isn't very well, and how to broach that if they haven't come forward about it, and you can see it's affecting their performance, and you need to bring the topic up with that individual.
Absolutely. It is, and it's about wording, isn't it? I've seen lots of managers trip over their wording because they worry about what they're going to say. Because ultimately they think, I don't want to get into trouble, and I don't want the business to get into trouble, and is it going to create a liability issue? But it's as simple as saying, if you've noticed something, I've noticed some changes in your engagement with work, or I just wanted to check in because you're not yourself. Is there anything you need? Is there anything we can do to help you? Which starts the dialogue. And not every woman knows that they're perimenopausal or menopausal. They just might feel weird. They might just feel like they can't handle things that they used to feel that they could handle previously. But it's not acceptable to kind of say directly, are you going through the menopause, or have you been to see your GP? Because even those words themselves can be quite emotive, can't they?
So Jo, can I ask that? I think the idea of having menopause as part of a wider well-being plan sounds brilliant. Absolutely. If you have a reasonable adjustment plan for the menopause, how regularly would you then advise somebody to be able to go back to it? Because as you're saying, we're talking, some people here, menopausal symptoms might change day to day, they might change monthly, so how would you advise a team to keep that as an open working document rather than something that's just gone back to and referred to at reviews?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think some of that depends on what processes you have in place yourself already as a business. So if you have monthly check-ins or monthly well-being meetings, or, how are their employees dealing with their normal day-to-day objectives, it forms part of that conversation. But I think initially when you have that conversation and the reasonable adjustment plan has been done, you have to kind of put a stake in the ground, because sometimes things get lost, don't they? And they get forgotten. And I think for me, I would be saying book another appointment to say we will talk about it like in a more concentrated way, at least once a quarter. But if your symptoms change or get worse, you need to come to me.
Yeah. And
So
it's
you're giving the
very,
responsibility, aren't you, to
yeah,
the individual as well as the manager?
yeah, which actually empowers them to talk to you and tell you what's happening, because you're saying we're giving you the platform to tell us, so do tell us, and
Yeah.
come forward. Yeah, good.
Yeah. Yeah.
How far does a business reasonably go? Because you're still trying to make it commercially viable with an individual. And I think that's a real challenging balance, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the term reasonable adjustment is just that. It's what's reasonable to me may not be reasonable to my manager or the business, and vice versa. And some of the things that we consider from a medical condition perspective when we look at reasonable adjustments is like, is there a cost to the business, and can the business sustain that cost? So at the end of a reasonable adjustment plan, you would have a list of things that would be reasonable. So the things like a fan and those sort of things would be relatively low cost to the business. Providing an air conditioning unit just for that person next to their desk might be a bit extreme and costly.
Yeah.
So you would determine as a business that's not reasonable. But in terms of like the time frame for that, Philippa, I think it depends on how severe the person's symptoms are and the impact that it's having on their work. So at some point you might be having a conversation about, a flexible working request to change someone's hours for a short period of time, or for a longer period of time. You may be looking at changing the duties that they undertake. But again, it's a very much of a balance. That, I encourage all of my clients to work with their individuals and obtain a balance that the business can support them as much as they can, and the individual feels supported, but there will always be a commercial element to that.
Mm.
It's the same with sickness, isn't there? You if someone has a medical condition which means that they have to have time off regularly, as a business, you're encouraged, if you use absence triggers, for instance, as a business, it would be reasonable for you to stretch your absence triggers for someone with a medical condition where their sickness is out of their control to a period of time. And at that point, you would probably do a capability review for that person to see whether you can sustain that level of absence. And that's where the commercial element fits in. And I would say that menopause is exactly the same. You would stretch what you would normally offer somebody to support the person who's going through menopausal symptoms. And as we know, as we've said, that could be like 15 years of someone's life that they're going through perimenopause and menopause. If you're a small business, you're not going to be able to sustain a high level of reasonable adjustments, because of the cost might actually be quite a burden to you. So as a business owner, I would say to you that get advice, obviously, from a HR consultant to support you, but also look at what is reasonable to you as a business and what can you do to support, and be open and honest about that and get an agreement to that, but evaluate it on an ongoing basis.
Great. Just before there's Ruth. Oh, sorry, Charlotte. I was
Can I
just
ask
going to
one?
say, anyone's got any questions that they want to put to Jo, just pop them in the group and I'll let Jo know.
Jo, I was just going to maybe more of an observation than a question is, I think, and I don't mean to sound cynical by this, by the way, it's well, it's a really tricky situation, isn't it? These two are laughing at me trying to find my words for obvious reasons. Everybody, we might, we can have a discussion around that too. We're forgetting what we're saying and why we've got into rooms. How do we support people who might not know what support they need? And that's it, because I think, you hear the discussions around menopause and people saying actually symptoms change, they feel very different days. They might not know what support they need.
Yeah.
How to what extent can a business advise on what support might be helpful to them? Do you cross the boundary? Does a business need to have an external party and menopause support for that employee to have an intermediary? Or, because I think that's it, particularly within a small business, you know, you might have somebody there who has an employee who's there on their knees going, menopause has hit me and I don't know whether I'm coming or going. And then you've got somebody who's never been in a position where they've had to face somebody going through the menopause. You know, they might have never been literally at the coalface fit. So how do we manage that dialogue?
Take the word menopause away from everything that you've just said, and you've got someone sitting in front of you that says, I don't know if I'm coming or going. What would you say to them?
Yeah.
I would be saying, what do you mean? How do you mean you don't know if you're coming or going? Well, I feel a little bit disorganised. Well, tell me how you're organising yourself at the moment. Does your thing to-do list feel overwhelming? Have you got too much, or you're just not planning? Just because we put menopause on the top of that question doesn't necessarily say that our approach has got to change. It doesn't. It's exactly the same as to dealing with someone who's having a bad day, dealing with someone who's got a cold, dealing with someone who's got problems at home, dealing with someone who's just disorganized because they're overwhelmed by their workload, are all still symptoms of menopause, but they're also still symptoms of life and being at work. So you should approach them in exactly the same way. Education is really important, and there are lots and lots and lots of information out there in the ether. But I think if you're committed to supporting staff, which you should be in any way, shape or form to a degree, with the commercial element attached to that, then you could invite a third party in to deliver menopause training, but that wouldn't just be for managers, it would also be for employees to raise their awareness. You know, I think I had memory loss when I was about 21. And that's because I was like trying to get married, and then I was buying a house, and then when my kids came along, everything fell apart really. And some of those symptoms I could say that I had then, I have now as a perimenopausal woman. But I've put strategies in place for myself. I have a things to do list. I still write things down. Sometimes I write them 3 or 4 times on different coloured post-it notes. But I've put strategies in for myself. And when I think back to when I was in a HR director's role when I realised I was perimenopausal, and I just had the shortest temper sometimes for no reason whatsoever, which was completely out of character for me. And actually it was another senior director who came to me and said, you know, at our age, when these things sort of happen, it could be like perimenopause, you know. And I was like, oh, I'm really not old enough for that. That's something my mum went through, and yes, she did go a bit crazy. But and it was actually another woman in the business on my level as a peer who came to me and said, Jo, you're not yourself. And that's all she said to me, you're not yourself. And so I think after 3 cups of tea, and I used to have a fridge full of chocolate actually, which had a big sticker on saying break here in case of emergency. But a lot of chocolate, 3 cups of tea and a conversation, I realised actually she was right. And at that point, that's where I went and got my support. And unfortunately, I couldn't get my support from my GP, which a lot of women find. And I was in a very privileged position where I could pay privately for that advice. I do go to my GP now, but there was nowhere near as much information out there as there is now when I really started going through perimenopause. And I was in a director's position and realised actually I didn't want to be operating at that level, knowing that there's so much going to change in my life. But I think the difference for me is that I was accountable.
I really like that. And the first bit you said, it really, I don't know if you've felt it, I physically felt the fear lifting of having that conversation with somebody. And I hope other employers felt that, you know, people running businesses, running team managers, the fear of the word menopause, and having conversations with employee when you said, take the word menopause out and actually just consider how would we approach those conversations? Are you all right? Because we all feel comfortable, don't we, doing that? Are you all right? Everything okay? Not quite. That feels very normal. For some reason, Ruth, I can see you going.
Well, it does to a lot of people. Not everybody, though. No. Not everybody is comfortable talking to somebody. Let's consider the dynamic of work environments. You know, not everybody is comfortable going up to somebody and saying, "Are you okay?" And somebody else might take that in a different way. It's the situation, isn't it?
Yeah, you always have to know your audience.
Yeah, I mean, I've made my views very clear on the build up to this that I don't want to do this. And it was only when Jo, explained her approach was like, okay, actually what this sounds like to me and how it becomes transferable into any situation, business, personal, anything, it's the art of being able to have difficult conversations. Like you said, take the word menopause out of it. It's anything. It's grief. It's miscarriage. It's cancer. It's divorce. It's anything. It's underperformance. It's
conflict.
The art of being able to have a conversation that's in difficult circumstances. And I think a lot of people would look inwardly and say, yeah, I'm not great at that. But that's then transferable. That's why when you talked about it's a well-being plan, we all want the best. Most human beings want the best for other human beings in personal and professional life. So yeah, that having a well-being plan for people within your organization, that speaks to me. But I think underpinning all of this is people struggle to have difficult conversations.
Absolutely.
And that for me is the thing.
And I think that's fair to say for most managers struggle to have difficult conversations regardless of what the topic is. And I think the only way to remove the pressure of that is to remove the labels that we keep attaching to different things, which is why I like saying well-being, because it's a rounded thing. It's a rounded view, and managers will spend their life in training every single day to learn about the next medical condition and the next level of mental health issues. Whereas if you're looking at things holistically and you're looking at the rounded well-being view, that's what we should be training managers in. It's having that conversation, having a difficult conversation, how to approach it, what's the end result of that conversation, and how do we get to that point? But also educating employees. It's everybody's responsibility for maintaining well-being in the workplace. Yes, employers have a lot more liability from a legal perspective, but actually, as a human being and as an individual and a menopausal woman, I am responsible for myself. And if I need help and I need support, I might not recognize it straight away. So I have my support network around me. But I am responsible also for saying, this is what I need right now.
But I think then that goes back to Charlotte's point at the very beginning, is when these things happen, and again, we can say menopause, whatever, anything else that happens, we might be in a very alien situation as an individual. So as we some people are born sensible and switched on. I definitely was not one of those. It's taken me a long time to understand myself, never mind everybody else. But you go through and then you suddenly, you're responsible for yourself. We know that, and most people do know, I need to understand what's happening to me, whatever that might look like. But actually getting to that point of what is happening is quite difficult. And there is this period, isn't there, of, well, as an individual, you're not 100% sure what's happening. And then so you have no idea how to then articulate that. Never mind then have the art of the difficult conversation. There's just all of these layers. But I think that, that responsibility of something isn't quite right, but I am accountable to now try and look at how I can help myself, which then helps whatever community at that point you're in, whether that's your community at home, with your friends, within work. It's all the same, isn't it, as human beings? It is.
I think so, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, I'm probably not sounding like a normal HR person at this point, but As an employer of choice, of course, I would want to really support all of my staff, all of them, regardless, to be the best version of themselves at work, achieve what they wanted to do at work. And I would want to support any kind of medical condition that anybody had that was suffering with at that time or was going through at that time. But that's because that's my value set as an employer. That's what I want. And each individual employer will have their own value set. And if we want to attract people and we want to retain people, we do have to do some things to show people that these are the things that we will do. I don't think there's any better advertisement for a business other than saying, we take wellbeing really seriously, and we work in partnership with our workforce to ensure that wellbeing is managed. But we do also know that there is a commercial element to that. There will always be a decision of cost, and the smaller business is not going to be able to pay full pay sick pay for somebody who might be off with any condition, let alone menopause symptoms, whereas a larger organisation has more of a responsibility and can afford to do much more to support people. But just having that conversation, starting that conversation, providing loose wear, a fan, a room, saying it's okay to go grab a cup of tea or have a walk, and encouraging people to do that are all things that don't cost a lot, but actually would mean quite a lot to people.
Isn't it? If somebody's under pressure at work, if we think about what's happened over the decades in the world of work and things that have come through, yes, we're tackling the subject of menopause, but previously to that, there was probably the big tackle around mental health, which then probably followed stress, people having breakdowns at work. This is all about well-being, about, like what you said, just the simplest of things, just take a bit of time. But then be accountable for when you come back, what can we now do? Because having that breather and that break sometimes quite valuable.
Everyone has a right to step away.
Yeah.
Just step away and take 5 minutes.
Go to your chocolate cabinet.
I so miss that fridge. I so miss that fridge.
Yeah, exactly. Maltesers for me every time. Just that's it.
I was going to say thanks to Fiona for her note on being accountable for your own situation. And I think it's about work colleagues, team working, and sometimes individuals sat there, if they're seeing a colleague not being themselves, they know them better than anything, and encouraging them to speak up. Because managers are, a bit like school teachers nowadays. There's lots of expectations, isn't there? You've got to do your job. And unfortunately, sometimes people may miss stuff, and this all comes down to leadership training and what you should be expected to see in an individual and their change in behaviour. But as a colleague, encourage a colleague if you can see they're struggling, to go and speak to their boss and have a conversation.
So can I just, there is something on that. So I don't naturally talk about stress levels. I don't talk about what's bothering me because of my family upbringing. Everybody has a different upbringing and there's things that they're used to and they feel comfortable with. I think it's quite an interesting thing. So if I didn't feel particularly comfortable sharing about it, that's hard for a manager to manage me if I am not willing to share that. And I just wonder whether there's a space. So many years ago when I did my coaching qualifications, one of the things I had to do was I had to be coached. So not only was I coaching, I had to be coached for somebody else on the course to practice their coaching skills. It is quite a skill and quite you have to be trusting, you have to be willing to be vulnerable to want to share. So I wonder if there's a space then actually for leadership and management to actually, as well as having menopause training, wellbeing training, actually to have wider training around those coaching skills, which is the skill of allowing somebody else the talking whilst you ask questions that allow them to come forward. Because But I think there is a bit of a space, because otherwise you're just, feel free to come and talk to me. I'd be like, yeah, great, cool, thanks. That would be the end for me.
Yeah,
that would not encourage me to come. I just wouldn't. It's just not in my nature.
I do agree, Charlotte. I think leadership training, regardless of the size of your business, is really important.
Yeah.
And it is the ability to have a conversation and actually listen actively, rather than just trying to get to your objective that you've set for that meeting.
Yeah.
And so I think leadership training, it takes all shapes and sizes, doesn't it? But I think leadership training is really key for all businesses. The minute you start to employ someone, your first person is where you should be thinking about leadership training. What kind of leader do I want to be? Because leadership and management are two different things, So you should be thinking, what do I want to be?
Yeah.
I also think the word you've used there, Charlotte, that's the most powerful for me is trust. And that's across a whole organisation. Yes, it comes down from the executives and the leadership team to make sure they the culture that they're building within their organisation hopefully is one that is a trusting culture. But
there's a legal requirement for trust.
Is there?
Your contract of employment, there's a legal requirement to trust each other as an employer and an employee. And either of the parties breach that trust, then it's a breach of contract. So your culture and the way that you approach people and the way that employees behave is built on trust. So it shouldn't be a shock to anybody.
Yeah, it's something that you take for granted, isn't it? Now you're saying it, and of course it's in all of our contracts.
Trust and confidence.
Even in business to business, it's in that side of things.
But do you know how many companies do you know that have trust as a value? Even though it's an underpinning requirement of an employment contract.
Yeah, I would say quite a lot of people that do actually. Yeah. I would say that they actually do, but what I haven't heard it recently, and I think this is my problem. Be
warned, everybody, she's coming.
It's coming. It's coming.
Trying to be so good.
So am I. I'm on Ruth's side.
So good, because it's just now I've lost my thread of where we are. I think I want us to get back to basics. I think that's where I am with it, because I think there's all of these. I'm so glad we're doing this week, because we're not doing it on Menopause Day or I am going for it on mental health. I appreciate we have to be aware. I get all of that.
Yeah.
I think we've diluted it over the years by having these days, and there's so many days now that we pick up on that one thing, and it's for that one day, and then we forget about it. But actually, as society, again, it's just getting back to basics. It is getting back to how you build relationships, how you build teams, how you have difficult conversations, how you build trust, how you're accountable, all of that just goes through everything within business that we have to do. And that's the fundamentals that we have to get right. And we all make mistakes. And that's another thing. Is to have the art of understanding when we fail. And if you're not failing at these sort of things, then you are not progressing. So, there's all of these things about within business and personal development and developing high-performing teams. High-performing teams get to high performance when they fail, because then they learn, then they put something into place, and then they go again.
Yeah,
I agree. It's just the fundamentals.
I think we do forget now. Yeah, no, Ruth, I completely agree with you. I think we do forget that it's okay to fail, because that is the only way that we learn. But I think sometimes expectations on managers is that shouldn't happen. But if a manager fails in their relationship with their employee, it's not necessarily just their fault. It's because they haven't been given the knowledge and skills that they need to be able to do that job. I'd like to pick up on Sarah's comment if I can, Philippa. Do you mind?
Yes. No, not
So
sure.
Sarah's made a comment. Hi, Sarah, about it's a big step to trust management for people. I absolutely agree. And organisations need to walk their values so employees can see genuine, equitable equality in place, and policies are helpful but meaningless if the culture differs. I absolutely agree with this, but I also have a different slant on it. Is that we're very much putting the responsibility on an organisation there to walk their values so employees feel that there's equitable status for them and they're feeling valued. But actually part of building a culture is also how the employee reacts and behaves in that culture. So I think the responsibility is on both parties to create a culture of openness. And you know, I've always said that policies are great, but if you don't behave in that way in your business. But I also remember having lots of conversations with employees who've come to talk to me and said, "Oh, my environment is toxic. The department I work in is toxic." And I usually say to them, "Well, how do you behave in your environment? How do you behave in your work environment? And what do you do to reduce that toxicity, or are you adding to that toxicity?" And I've always been able to have an open conversation, as you know, Philippa. I'm not backwards in coming forwards and questioning people and things like that. But culture is a two-way street. Yes, it's dictated by the company initially, but as an employee, you've got to buy into it. You've got to be part of it, and if you're not part of it, you're also part of the problem.
I also think as well, lots of companies are delivering certain training to tick the box.
Yeah.
As well, it's almost about the branding of the training, because we're hearing more about obviously menopause training. We've discussed today as part of well-being, but it's that headline in the business, isn't it? Because if there's a headline and it said testicular cancer training, people may react to that and say, what training's that? What are we doing? But in a way, we are doing that with menopause. And is there bereavement training? Is there dealing with cancer training? Is there getting a divorce training? So I think the challenge now for HR departments, when they're trying to educate their employees, they've also got to be marketeers and brand these topics. And well-being is such a great heading by the sound of it. I think that sounds what we do, and cover all of it within that.
Yeah, and I think if I took all of the things that you just mentioned there and I listed all of the symptoms that I know that people suffer with, anxiety and depression or change at home, they would fit under every category of mental health or a medical condition or menopause or cancer or any of those things. So I don't feel there's a need to brand. I think there is a need to be broader in the view, because you can educate on that basis. You can educate. So if someone has depression, what can we do? Well, the depression might be caused by 101 things, whether it's outside of the workplace or inside the workplace. So your approach to it should be the same regardless of the tag that's attached to it. So that's why I prefer to look at it from a wellbeing perspective.
Fantastic. Okay, and obviously we know a very good person called Jo Jinks who will deliver this training for you.
Absolutely.
But if you want to do menopause training or whatever category, she'll do that as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's always better to bring a third-party company into your business to deliver any kind of leadership training, because if there's been any falter in the way a manager has been perceived or the leadership in your business has been perceived, if they then try to deliver the training, it's just not bought into. So I think bring in the people that know the stuff and let those people train the managers and let those people raise awareness of employees, because education around menopause is not just important for women, it's also important for people that are transitioning. It's also important for men. Men who are married to women who are going to go through the menopause need also this knowledge, but it also affects them at work. If they've got a wife who's really struggling and they come into work, it's still stress. It's still something that they've got to deal with. You know, and my husband, I think I told you this story, and he'll kill me for saying this on LinkedIn, but it's tough. He came home from work one day and said to me, "Oh, I've been talking to one of the ladies in the office about menopause today, about her symptoms." And I was like, "When did we have that conversation?" But he is a senior manager in a business, so he was doing his job well, and he knows if he comes home and tells me that he hasn't, he'll get the HR view of his wife, which is never very good. But I just thought, when did we have that conversation? But it was just a lack of knowledge and awareness, so that's why that conversation didn't take place.
So I like that. Can I say something a little bit controversial? I want to break, what I'm loving about this conversation is it's breaking down the stigma of us, women, them as men. This is what we're going through, this is what they don't know. And I love the fact that by saying it, take the title away, we all have these symptoms for different reasons. We all feel overwhelmed, we all feel forgetful, we all feel stressed. And for me, I love that because it puts everything back on an equal footing and an equal standing. And I think that's a really, really effective way to come into this conversation, because exactly like you're saying, everybody will know somebody who's going through one of these symptoms from whichever headline column it is for some reason. So actually, let's have a broad and open conversation about it. Yeah, Jo, I love that. I love that. And sometimes you have to say to it, you know, dealing with, you're doing any business training, you know, all of us here around the table will do lots of business training and support work. And actually say, hang on a second, do you have these conversations with your husband, or do you have these conversations with your wife? And they go, no. And it's like, why? You know, that's the practice training ground where you practice to have those conversations, and you make your mistakes because you know that love is unconditional, and then you come back to work to practice those skills, don't you? To say, oh,
There's a question here from Jackie about some people are fearful of losing their position or status at work if they speak up too much. How can we encourage them to trust?
So that lack of trust will probably come from the culture that they come from. And I know the lovely Jackie is a menopause coach. So if I had someone in one of my clients who had someone who had that fear in them, they're not going to tell my client, but I'd be pushing them to a menopause coach who would help them deal with why they felt that fear in the first place. Because that fear will have come from something, either they've witnessed it at work and someone has been mistreated badly, or it comes from a different place. I think, you know, from a personal perspective, I didn't fear losing my position. I just felt I feared not being able to perform at the level I needed to as a HR director. I made my own choices in relation to that, but people do fear that. And I would encourage them to have the conversation, but I would also be saying to them, because I'm a HR person, is when you've had the conversation, write it down, get it listed, make sure that it's a documented conversation that you've had, so that you have got an evidence trail if you need it. And if you feel that you are being mistreated, you're not being listened to, and you're not being given advice, or your manager's not following through on the conversation, then it becomes a grievance issue. But I think there's a lot of things that we can do to prevent someone raising a grievance, and it is about the conversation. But the grievance procedure is there for people who feel that they cannot have a conversation without the fear attached to it, or that they're going to be treated in an unfavourable way. But I think the fear comes from a different place. It will come from a toxic culture, probably, or something that someone has experienced before.
Can I ask
think that's... All I was going to say was, I think that's really important, because again, this just loops back around onto this well-being piece, because I can definitely identify with this fear of losing position or status when you are then vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so I run my own business, so I don't need to report into anybody, but I would say that if I was in the situation when I was working, and I was working for somebody now, I could feel that. But I know that has come from a place from previous organisations when I did open up, say I was struggling, and then it was used against me. Now, I am going to say this is back in the 90s and the early 2000s, but that stayed with me.
It does.
I think there's a real there's a powerful thing to have coaching and counselling when you try and identify a bit when you're struggling, and the external. It's exactly what you've just said, Jo. Reaching out externally, that if you can, and you can get it through your private health or whatever that may look like, is to have somebody externally to talk through these things. Sometimes if you've got great friends as well, they're great to lean on because they might have experienced things, but talking externally about something, because I think Jackie's point is really valid. There's a lot of people that suddenly get to a point in their life where there's something quite serious, but they may have experienced something years ago that has created a behaviour, and they need to break that cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I pick up on something that Ruth said? Because actually it is linked to a question I wanted to ask. For business owners, I live in Northamptonshire. Northamptonshire's got the highest number of micro and small businesses in the country. We're a really entrepreneurial, really exciting kind of employment sector, which means lots of people work for themselves, lots of people work for someone else but associate with other businesses. That's just, but likewise, we've got huge national, well-known brands from Northampton. How, as a business owner or as a one-man band small business, Jo, do you think we manage that dialogue externally? Because obviously the support's there internally within a business. Just for the sake of it, Ruth, sorry, guinea pig for a second. Here's Ruth, been running a really, very successful business, really well known in the industry, really well known in the sector. Everything's brilliant, but she's the business owner. So obviously, how can a business owner ask for the same support from the team? Do they have to express, very high, potentially what they see as high vulnerability to raise it? How would you advise that conversation?
I would never let a manager show vulnerability in case they've got a tiger waiting in the background. I would always, I do get approached by business owners who feel like this. They may be going through the menopause. It may be overwhelming because they feel like they're, when you get to the top of the tree, it's a lonely place to be, isn't it? So I always recommend that they speak to a coach of some sort, whether it's a personal coach or it's a business coach, because that's the outlet. That's a peer group, that's a safe place for the business owner to be. I do encourage, though, however, from experiencing this when I worked for Severn Trent, I do encourage managers to say, I'm really sorry, I'm not feeling it today, so just bear with me. Or I'm a bit tired, so I'm just going to sit in here for an hour, just get myself together, and be open about that, because that actually then encourages an employee to come in and say, I'm not having a good day today, guys. I'm really sorry. If I snap, I'm really, really sorry. And I've always encouraged my teams to do that, because otherwise you sit there like a bear with a sore head and everyone starts judging you. Well, what's wrong with her today? Why can't I go in her office today? Why is the chocolate fridge been open all day? All of those sort of things. But I think for when you're a business owner, whether you're a standalone business owner or you're a business owner with a great amount of people working for you, I always say get a coach. Get a coach, someone that you can talk to on that level. It's a confidential conversation. They'll be on your side, but they'll also challenge you as well.
I totally agree with that. I agree with the coach. I also agree with the coach side of things, because I think you need to start to understand who you are. And you need to understand, so there's different elements that you need to understand who you are as a leader, as an individual, a leader or a manager. When you're running a business, I think you need to understand who you are and the culture you want to set within your organisation. Because I'll throw an opposite situation to about, go in and say you're not feeling that great. I saw somebody speak probably about 12 years ago, and they said something to me, and my team know this. they said, if you're having a bad day and it's really bad, don't go in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't go in. And I sat there, I was like, this is before the days of remote working. I was like, wow, what? Okay. It's like, because the minute you walk in that door, as the leader of that organisation, all faces are on you.
Yeah, they know.
If it's something that you actually think, I just need to deal with this today, stay away.
Yeah. I think that's a great piece of advice.
And I took that on because there were some certain times where I would be struggling, whatever it might be, and it will be, I'm not coming in today. Now, the team would know I'm not coming in today just meant I've got too much on and I need some breathing space.
Yeah.
But by coming in, if I'd got too much on, it's, as much as you try and hide it, you either overcompensate or it's visible over your face.
Some companies have days, don't they? Don't they have a certain amount of days a year?
Duvet days.
I've heard it recently.
I'm not talking about not doing any work. I need us still to be, my head was still going 100 miles an hour. I just need to come in and
by yourself.
Yeah.
I think it's right, Ruth, because ultimately you are the business owner and people will go, oh, as I said, I'm not going to go in there today. Whereas, you should stay away. People don't need to see it. They're looking at you for leadership all the time. They're looking for you to be bright, happy, driven, approachable, all of those sort of things. And if you've woken up that day and you're not feeling it and you're not going to be any of those things, there might be a situation that occurs that you can't control,
Well, a big part of our training with leadership has been about controlling state.
Yes.
What I do with Fiona, because you have such a huge impact because people know you sometimes better than yourself. I'm going to go back to the chat.
Sarah's got a great comment.
So similar to mental health first aid in the workplace, does Jo offer training for menopause champions in the workplace?
I work with an amazing lady called Linda Bailey. Who works in businesses. She offers masterclasses around these sort of things. And I deliver a section for her, encouraging employees on how to raise menopause in the workplace for themselves. She does an amazing session on mental health. However, is this controversial to say that I don't believe that we should have a menopause champion? I think we have a well-being champion because that covers mental health, cancer, menopause, and any other medical condition. And let's give access to everybody in the workplace for someone to go and talk to, not just someone for menopause.
Interesting. Thank you, Jo. And Sarah, home working has impacted on this. We know each other in different ways, so can't spot as easily someone who is struggling and also harder to access support.
Isn't it funny how COVID catapulted us about 5 years in advance and made everybody work from home? Did anybody really train managers on how to manage people remotely? No. Did anybody really train managers on how to recognise signs over Teams that someone was struggling that day? Because sometimes you can't see that they've got the pajamas on underneath. They've got a nice tie on and a shirt, but they've got the pajamas because they're having a bad day. And again, I think it's about education. It's like, having a session with managers to say, okay, how do we identify if someone's having a bad day and they're working from home? What sort of things should we be concentrating on? What sort of things can we put in place for people so they've got access? And let's say if you have a well-being person, a well-being champion in your workplace, and you make that available to your employees, it won't matter where they're working, they know they're available. But it's like having an employee assistance program. I've worked with lots of organisations that have put an employee assistance program in place to help people with, pick up the phone if you're struggling, if you've got financial issues, if you've got mental health issues. And some companies have actually removed it because only 25% of the workforce used it. So I think it's really hard for businesses to notice this when people are working from home. And I do understand why people have started to bring people back into the workplace, but that in itself is going to cause issues because people have been working from home for such a long time.
Another discussion for another day, I think. Right.
Yeah.
We have 5 minutes left. If anybody in the audience would like to ask any questions, please go ahead.
Oh, it is such a thank you. I think I came into this conversation a little bit like Ruth, worried that I'd said the wrong thing, worried that me being a little bit more of a guarded person wouldn't feel very empathetic to the situation. That's me, that's not anyone else. And I think, Jo, it's been really, really encouraging to hear how your approach to it and how the businesses that you then support is fostering this best practice culture. And I'm a massive advocate for company culture, inclusive, diverse, everybody's welcome to the table.
Absolutely.
That is, and I think that's been lovely to hear this, how for you menopause just fits under that umbrella. You're welcome, you're accepted as you are today, you're accepted as you are tomorrow. And I think it's really, really refreshing. And I think it's not there to be afraid of, and it's not there to cause a divisive culture, and it's not there to be something that we bash over people's head when they don't understand. It's actually to say, no, help, give me a bit of hand here, this is going on, but you've got that going on, so are you all right? So no, it's been a really, really interesting stance, so thank you for sharing your knowledge.
I really liked your point then, Charlotte, when you said about the emotional side of things, that you might not be like that attached to that situation. And I actually have the opposite effect. Sometimes with managers, they take on too much, they get too emotionally involved and try to solve issues. And my advice is, if you don't know the answer, don't answer the question, go and find the answer and go and find the expert. Don't get emotionally involved. You can absolutely support somebody without getting emotionally involved, because ultimately as a manager, you are representing the business. And sometimes when you get emotionally involved in situations, you lose the respect of the person, lose the respect of the business, because you're not representing the business. And there's nothing worse than really, really supporting somebody that you then have to take through a capability exit or any other HR process that has a negative effect. It can be damaging to the relationship. So I always say, remove emotion, look at the situation and try and find a solution.
Yeah.
And on Fiona's last point, I love the old-fashioned name for menopause, change of life. I think that concludes our session. Thank you to Ruth and Charlotte for your fabulous questions, and Jo, super discussion today. And yes, get in touch with Jo, Synergize HR. The details are on LinkedIn, and she'll come in and do all sorts of bespoke HR training, coaching, etc. Ladies,
thank you for inviting me on today.
Yeah, no, thank you for facilitating a very balanced conversation, is what I will say.
Thank you.
Okay. And thanks to the audience for their input.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining in.
Sorry, Charlotte, very quickly, your sexual harassment session.
24th, we're going to be discussing all the new legislation around sexual harassment. So that'll be a panel discussion, not dissimilar to this. We've got 2 employment lawyers coming on to talk about it, and we're going to be a little bit of education, a little bit of discussion. Do we need this? How it's going to implement business? It's kind of my discussion, so it'll be raw and honest and out there, just like this one's been today. So hopefully loads of learning. So join us on LinkedIn Live. Philippa and Ruth, you will be there, but you will be there in the chat, I think, for this one, won't you, rather than actually on the panel. So we have Tracy Clay, who's somebody that the 3 of us work very closely with. She's going to be on as a co-lead, and then 2 employment lawyers. So really exciting. And that'll be advertised over the next couple of days, so please keep an eye out for that.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Philippa.
Okay. Thank you, ladies. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, guys. See you soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.